Storefront, a podcast about design work and life by the Toronto Design Directory. I'm your host, Margot Trudell, and my guest today is many things. An award-winning editorial designer of over a decade, the current president of the RGD, and the owner of Issues, a brick-and-mortar magazine shop. We're going to talk about building community and running businesses in Toronto, and how she possibly finds the time to do everything that she does. Let's go say hi to Nicola Hamilton. Hey, how's it going?
Hey, I'm good. I have the same question for you. How do you possibly find all the time to do what you do?
You can't start the episode and immediately turn this around. You're the guest. I know we both have a lot of stuff to say on that subject. But let's start with your design work first, because I think that's where it's really, everything kind of starts for you as far as like your career and really your designer life. Your work and your background is primarily in editorial design. And just want to start off with saying, what got you initially interested in editorial design? How did you kind of come to find that niche, and why do you like it so much?
Okay, so I think my answer has changed a little over the years. You know how like careers only make sense when you're like looking at them in the rearview mirror? Like your decision making on your career doesn't make sense until you're like through part of it. So earlier in my career, I think I would say that I was drawn to editorial design, to magazines, because it's kind of the bringing together of so many things that I loved, right? It's composition and layout design, but it's also typography and art direction. It's illustration and photography, and also writing, editing, learning. And so that is what drew me to it initially. Now, in hindsight, a little older, maybe a little wiser, magazines have been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. So my mom is an equestrian photographer, which is a very niche thing, horses. Yeah. But her livelihood was selling images. So she's photographed almost all of the World Equestrian Games, the Olympics, and selling those photos to magazines, right? To be in the magazines or on the magazine covers. And so her office, which was right outside of my bedroom growing up, was just plastered with magazine covers, and like a really particular niche kind of magazine. But I think that was probably in my subconscious the whole time. It's not something I've sort of acknowledged or recognized until more recently.
So, but you didn't get into horse magazines specifically.
No. No, I mean, I guess I got into design first, right? I went to design school. I'm a Humber College graduate, 3-year graphic design graduate. I finished school in 2011. And so I got into design first. And then from there, started sort of figuring out what genre of design I really dug.
I mean, you've been lucky to build a career in editorial design, because like it is a small niche. I can't imagine how many editorial design jobs specifically there are in Toronto. But you've managed to consistently work in that field. You haven't had to kind of move into other parts of design, which I think a lot of people would. Why do you think that is? Do you think you just kind of got lucky, or do you think your talents are really carrying you forward there?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Like I don't know that we get anywhere in our careers without talent or a bit of luck. I also think for the first 10 years of my career, I had a real champion and editorial design mentor. So my first job out of school, full-time job, there's a little bit of interning and there's a little bit of freelance work here and there, in that bridge between school graduation and full-time employment. But my first full-time job was at a publication called The Grid, and the founding creative director of The Grid, so my first boss, her name is Vanessa Wise, and Vanessa and I worked together on and off for 10 years. We worked together at The Grid. She taught me so much. And, now as somebody sort of more seasoned teaching sort of earlier in their career designers, you understand how much work actually goes into mentoring a young designer and teaching them. So sure, you can have raw talent and have some fundamentals, but I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah, none of us do.
No. And so she really, really taught me a lot at The Grid, and that experience taught me a lot. And then, The Grid went away, it closed, which is something that as an editorial designer, you have to get quite comfortable with, the idea that sometimes these publications that you love and sustain you will go away, and that's outside of your control. Before Vanessa went on to spearhead a redesign of Chatelaine, which is a almost 100-year-old women's title legacy media brand here, and I joined her for that adventure. I stuck around after her consulting gig was up as deputy art director, before eventually joining her at Studio Wise, where she was building an editorial-driven small boutique studio design practice. And I spent a few years there with her before going out on my own, which was supposed to be a like 1-year sabbatical away from client driven work for me to like basically dig myself out of like a really deep burnout. In the end, a pandemic happened. And so I like started my sabbatical in January of 2020 and like used January and February to like put some feelers out and start to figure out and like sleep and eat properly and exercise and those things. And then the pandemic hit in March, which was when some of my plans were meant to, be put into action. So your question was like the career and being able to sustain myself. Like part of that was just having a mentor that like really gave a shit about my career and who I worked really well with for a decade.
It has to be luck. Not that you don't deserve it, but just finding somebody that you really can just kind of ride on their coattails a little bit, and they just follow them and they teach you everything they know. Like that's amazing. And I think very few people are lucky enough to find that, especially a mentorship kind of relationship that lasts for like 10 years, like yours has. I think a lot of young people too today are asking more about getting mentors, certainly more than when I was coming out of school 10 years ago. People, you would like reach out to professionals for advice and that kind of thing. But now people are very specific. Like, I want a mentor. I want somebody to kind of tell me what to do in a lot of ways. And does it sound like that? Was that kind of what your relationship with Vanessa was like? Was she just telling you do this, do this, this, or was she kind of like guiding you and leading you towards figuring out your own answers and solutions?
I think it was a little bit of guiding. On occasion, there was telling. I mean, what we did together was deadline-driven work, and so there's only so much guiding you could do before you have to be like, no, it needs to be blue.
Right, yeah.
You just need to make that change, and we need to send that page to the printer. So I think it was a lot of guiding. I think sort of the other thing that I was so fortunate to get is in that mentorship, it wasn't a formal mentorship in that way. It happened organically because this is the person that I worked for. And over years of working together, you develop a friendship too. So you care about each other's success in that way and you champion each other. And it just so happened that we both deeply, deeply cared about the kind of design that we did. And I think that's the thing, that when you're looking for a mentor, if thinking about it just in, I need a mentor to tell me what to do in my career and to open doors for me, that's a one-sided friendship. That's a one-sided relationship. And those are not often sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So you worked up until, let's just say 2020, or you're building your editorial design career. Then you're like, okay, I need a break, burnout, which I want to talk to you more about in a little bit. And then the pandemic happens. And of course, we're all like thrown for a loop. Nobody knows what's going on, at least the first few months. What do you do once everything's settled in a little bit and you can kind of start to make plans for the future? What was your next step after that?
It's so funny because I don't think about time as very linear in that period. Like, I'm like, wait, what happened? So, okay, Best Health landed in my lap. So a previous contact of mine, the incredible Christina Vardanis, who was the executive editor at Chatelaine when I was working at Chatelaine, Christina approached me. She had just started a new job working for Reader's Digest Canada and was given the task of redesigning and repositioning this women's health title called Best Health. And I'm not going to lie, I'd never heard of the title until Christina called and said, hey, I have this thing. And Christina said, like, can you help me understand like what it would look like for us to work together? I'm going to try and figure out what it would look like on my side. Let's sort of figure it out. And she said, but this is not a full-time position. This is a part-time contract position. And I sort of said, that's the best. Like, I'm supposed to be on sabbatical, but now there's a pandemic. I can't do any of these things. Like, I'm not sure I want to commit to anything either. It worked out wonderfully. We got to, together with Rebecca Philps, who was part of that early team and is now Best Health's editor-in-chief, we repositioned the magazine. We stripped out all of the sort of quasi-science influencer wellness stuff, refocused it on being sort of expert doctor-driven, research-based content while still having a ton of fun. And that's a publication that I've worked on since 2020, and we're working on its last issue now before it goes away.
Oh. Another closure.
Another closure.
You're right. You do have to always be ready for that to happen.
Yeah. I sort of think about it. I mean, the same way if you're somebody who's doing branding for small businesses or startup ventures of some sort, like that cycle exists. So Best Health landed in my lap, and that sort of started me designing again and reaching back out to some of the sort of photographer and illustration collaborators that I had, and it gave me a steady income. Basically, it paid me not a very good salary because it was a part-time position, but a salary. It paid me monthly, and that was pretty great. And that gave me sort of the stability and something to do that sort of started to dig me back out of that burnout and also the like chaos spiral we were all in post-pandemic. And I started thinking about like, okay, I've grieved this sabbatical I thought that I was going to get. I'm not going to get it. What can I start sinking some energy into that'll feel good, that'll feel interesting, and that'll set me up for whatever I think the next phase of my career is. Like, it really did feel like this moment for me of like, what's my next act? What's the next phase of this sort of professional life that I'm building for myself? Because I've always really believed that like you are in control of your career path, as much as there is luck and connection and hard work and all that stuff. Like you can actually control some of those things. And one of the things that was really obvious to me was just how much I loved magazines, how much I loved this landscape. And folks outside of the magazine industry might not have seen this in the same way, but how much we were looking to those publications during the pandemic to give us like real useful information and to actually distill some of the junky information that the government was giving us, right? To ask some of the hard questions. And so you're sort of seeing this as something that folks are spending more time with or do still need, believe in, respect in some way. And then at the same time, we're watching a lot of those organizations lay off a lot of journalists and creative folks during that time as well. And so I started thinking about, everyone I talked to is pretty bummed out about this industry, but it's still one of the coolest jobs in the world. Like there's still glamour to it. I still get to work with incredible people. You still get to dive into topics that you wouldn't otherwise think to dive into. How do I start injecting some energy, some life back into this industry, or how do I support this industry? And I just sort of started poking around and asking some friends, like, what's missing? What is not here in Canada that exists in parts of the world where there is energy in the magazine scene? And one of the sort of obvious things was a retail landscape. We don't have a magazine retail landscape. We didn't really. Small pockets, there were people doing cool things, but usually in one corner of the industry or pretty exclusive or inaccessible. And that's where issues came.
I mean, I want to add this quote that I found in an interview that you did with Canadian Women in Design a couple of years ago, obviously before you opened the shop, but you said, "I'd love to figure out how to help foster an independent publishing scene in Canada. The state of the industry here is deplorable, but there's an active and thriving industry in Europe and the States. There are more talented editorial designers and writers and editors freelancing here on Canadian soil than ever, and the data shows that most of the population is still reading print. Anyways, it's a pipe dream, but if anyone reading this has a project or money to give to one, slide into my DMs." I'm like, that's so cute because I know what happened now. Like,
yeah, it was a pipe dream. It was like one of those things. I keep what I call a life list. It's not like a goals list. It's just like a list of mundane and giant things that I want to do at some point. And Own a Magazine store has been on there for a while. And it's pretty wild that I'm sitting in it right now in the back room.
That's so exciting to watch. And I love seeing a little bit like, well, I just had this idea, I had this dream. And then you're able to look back a couple years later when like it's finally happened. And it's like, wow, that dream became reality. Like you really did the thing. That's so awesome.
Yeah, I don't know how.
Well, okay, let's get a little more into it because you opened issues it was 2022, I believe.
Yeah. So I started working on issues in earnest in the spring of 2021. And I sort of marked that by an email I sent to sort of an industry colleague, Jeremy Leslie, who we've crossed paths at Design Thinkers, at other conferences and judging things. We both exist in this teeny tiny global independent magazine world industry. And I sent Jeremy Leslie an email because Jeremy has owned and operated Mag Culture for almost 20 years now. And Mag Culture has been documenting the independent magazine landscape worldwide as a blog for years. And almost 8 years ago now, Jeremy opened a retail store for Mag Culture in London, England. So I sent Jeremy an email. He's the best, right? Like he is the Mag Culture is sort of the pinnacle of my aspirations for what issues could be. And I mean, unnamed magazine store at that time of what it could be. And I sent him a note and said, I think I want to do this. I think there's a market for it. It might be a wild experiment. I don't know how to start. Can I ask you some nosy questions? And he said, yeah, which was sort of a testament to the network that I had built up over the years. Like the fact that I could just email this person and ask them these things was amazing. And we did. I don't know, I think it was like 3 p.m. my time and really early in the morning for him, or vice versa. I never remember how those time zones work. But he answered a whole lot of questions. He introduced me to a whole lot of people. He explained the sort of financial side of it or how it works for them. And that was incredible. Like that really was the first step. So I sort of mark that as the moment that I started working on this project in earnest. And just over a year later, in July of 2022, we opened the store.
Yeah, that's very generous, especially to share all the financial stuff. Because that's like, I think the thing that a lot of people get stuck on when starting any kind of business, it just is tricky. So that's really like a kind of him.
Well, and you have to. So I filled out a business plan. There's loans. Like this is not something that I could finance on my own. And filling out the business plan was like, we're designers. We like to be able to like research stuff and come with concrete information, and, you know, fact check things and point to stuff, average out some data. And when you're building a business plan, half of it is making shit up. Like and the more I sort of dove into it, the more I would go and ask other sort of business people I knew, like, how do I answer this question? And they were like, it's just a best guess. And I was like, what do you mean it's a best guess? Like the bank's going to choose to give me money or not based on my best guess?
Yep. Businesses are just like a hope and a wish, and like, I'm going to try real hard to make it happen.
Yeah. It was, I mean, that was really eye-opening in that idea that I think I have believed my entire career that none of us really know what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Which is kind of freeing in a way, right?
Yeah, it is for me at least. And sort of, I mean, in that moment, it was really frustrating because I think I was through the research, I was trying to prove to myself that this wasn't a bananas business idea. But there was no information to back me up necessarily, or I could poke holes in a lot of the information that I could find. And so that was really sort of disheartening in those moments. But reminding myself again that like, okay, more ridiculous business ideas have come to fruition than the one I'm doing. It's a traditional retail store. If I keep thinking about it like that, we should be able to make sense of it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm always jealous of friends of mine who own like fairly traditional businesses, not because it's necessarily easy or even simple, but like it's just clear cut. Like you're selling magazines, you know. I have a friend with a record store who sells records. They, you know, everybody works very hard, but it's just like end of the day, you know what the job is, kind of thing.
So I don't know if we've talked about this before, but folks ask me all the time about, sorry, you opened a magazine store. That must be so hard, so challenging. It's not. Like the day-to-day work of owning the shop is so much easier than my design practice. And I was trying to figure out like why. Why is it easier? And my current conclusion is that I don't have to justify my value at every turn. So it's a straightforward retail business that the price tag is on that magazine, flip through it, decide if it's worth that to you or not. You know, you can only afford X amount of dollars. Well, that's up to you to look at the shelves and figure out how to put that together. Where in a service industry like design, we're constantly being asked to do it faster, cheaper, with less resources. And there is no sort of consistent understanding of our value. And then I think design's also so subjective, right? If you ask me why a magazine is the price it is, I can tell you the wholesale price of it is X amount of dollars. That's what they charge me per issue. And then the shipping duty on top of it cost us X amount of dollars, and we need to make this margin on it. Like I can give you that equation, where with design, you know, my rationale for choosing a particular font may or may not resonate with you because design is visual and therefore pretty subjective. Well, and opening issues actually changed sort of my relationship to the way I think about designing for small businesses. I don't do a lot of that, right? Like I do editorial design, it's different, but my sort of understanding of how doing brand identity work or marketing collateral for a small business, my understanding of that changed dramatically when all of a sudden I was the client. So I hired Studio Millie, a friend of mine, the wonderful Kate Wharton's agency, to do issues original brand identity, because I just knew I wouldn't get it done. It's not my area of specialization. And also I'm writing a business plan. I'm trying to get financing. I'm trying to learn about distribution, and I'm trying to design the interiors, and the sort of that thing that I knew I could do by myself would be the thing that got left to the very, very end. And I just knew it mattered more than that. So I invested some money in hiring them to do that. And it was such an incredible exercise. It was so fun to be on that side and to jam with the team there. They over delivered a billion ideas that were all amazing and made it so hard to pick. But one of the things that was so fascinating is even coming to the deliverables, right? You assume part of getting your brand identity together is saying, okay, and I need this, 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 and this. I had no idea what I needed. I had no clue. My instinct for, even as a designer, knowing everything I know about design, my instinct for a brand identity was to pick the most basic thing, the simplest thing, and then wait until we were actually in market and things were happening and responding after that. And so that's just not how we've sort of packaged design services in the past. And so it sort of changed my, it changed my sort of sympathetic reaction to clients in that situation.
Yeah, especially starting a brand new business where you really don't know what you're going to need. You can guess, but like you say, it's just guesses. It's nice to have that kind of ongoing relationship with someone that can evolve with you a little bit design-wise.
Yeah, and I think it also sort of changes the way we think about those projects too, right? I mean, I can obviously do some of these things myself once I have the basic kit, and that's how Issues operates. But um, it did sort of change the way I would think about approaching a brand project in the future. Like, I think I would be more, okay, like, what do you need right now? What's the minimum viable product? Let's make those decisions. Come back to me in 6 months when you've got a new list of things that you need.
So as far as the physical store goes too, like you've cited shops in New York and London as being really successful, really impactful kind of magazine stores in those places. And Toronto, as much as I love it, is a different place than both of those cities. We're a smaller city. We're like half the size of New York, give or take. And our art scene here is very different than either of those as well. So on that kind of level, what made you think that running a magazine store here would work?
I didn't know. It was a big experiment, really. I can say a year and a half in that the experiment appears. Early signs indicate a successful experiment, a sustainable business. But I wasn't sure. I think for me, it was the understanding that we didn't have anything like Issues in Canada. There wasn't anything at the sort of level, the caliber of Casa magazines in New York being this like sort of corner store magazine newsstand institution. There wasn't anything as sort of community driven or invested in the industry as mag culture is in London. There just wasn't anything. So Canada became my market over Toronto, which has its own challenges. We are massive geographically. Shipping is chaotic at best. But so Canada kind of became my market. Seeing how many independent publications were coming out of Canada and how little the sort of global industry recognized that those publications were Canadian, that was an interesting indicator for me. There's really cool stuff happening here coming out of this city that's actually making big waves internationally in the magazine scene. So that's a good indicator. Good stuff is happening here. And then just the understanding or the assumption that there would be more people like me in the city who wanted these things, who sought these things out when they travel, who might be into being a regular customer somewhere closer to home.
Yeah, and like you're a designer, you're kind of very into the design community here, as am I. But I imagine there's people outside of the design community or even the arts in general who have gravitated towards your store, right?
Yeah, I mean, my hope for Issues when I was first sort of conceiving of the idea was really that it would become a clubhouse for industry types and magazine lovers alike. And that is definitely folks in the creative field. So like our audience is primarily creatives, and we define creatives pretty broadly: writers, poets, illustrators, photographers, designers, typographers, fine artists, industrial designers, architects, interior designers, like that really that creative industry really is our biggest demographic. And that industry is quite dense in Toronto. So if you were to like plot creatives on a map of Canada, I imagine Toronto would be the darkest dot, would be my guess. So but we've also become a bit of a cultural hub for specific niches as well. So by opening our space up for collage events, we have a couple of artists who come in and host collage events here, Alana Chelmick and Be Wise, who host collage events here regularly. So we get folks who just like making stuff. And often those folks are like developers, lawyers, accountants, like folks who don't get to be creative very often and want to come do something with their hands. And so that's really fun. So it's sort of, it's spawned outwards.
Well, let's pivot a little bit into talking about community then. And I do want to touch on your work with the RGD a little bit too, but just starting from, issues and having it as a community hub and hosting these events and stuff like that. Like, have you enjoyed your time doing this? Is there something that you would like to see changed or done differently in this way?
I've enjoyed it immensely. I think that's my favorite part. Like when the shop is packed full of bodies, all focused, like collective energy focused on a given topic brings me so much joy. To see it full like that in the summer is the best when it like spills out onto the sidewalk and we're all kind of sweaty. If I'm romanticizing shop days. No, I think I've enjoyed it immensely. I think creative community is so important. I think so much of the sort of creative industry relies on networking. So much of it relies on who you know or who you can ask questions of, right? Again, none of us really know what we're doing. And so getting a gut check is so important. And I think being able to do that in a way that is, I'm trying to think of the right word for it, deeper, I guess, than just kind of the sort of superficial email that you could send to someone or DM you could send to someone, like actually having physical spaces to gather and spend time and talk about things, I think is so valuable.
On that note, I am going to ask you about your time with the RGD, Registered Graphic Designers. And right now you're the president of that, but you've not always been the president. You've had a few different roles there, right?
To go back to sort of early career path. So I graduated school in 2011. I was an RGD student member, but not like active. I didn't do very much with it. I think it got me a portfolio review. That's all the only sort of intrinsic value I saw in it at that time. And then I got my first job and I didn't feel like I needed the organization and money was tight. So I wasn't paying for my RGD dues. And then the Grid, the publication I worked for, went away. And I realized in that moment, I'd worked there for 3 years. It was 2014. So I was like no longer sort of an entry-level designer. I wasn't a junior designer anymore. I had a network, but my network was all magazine people. And a lot of them weren't even in Canada. Like my network was pretty global at that point. And I felt really disconnected from sort of the design scene outside of my peers that I had graduated with. I didn't really know anyone else practicing design. My community was quite small. So I figured I've been laid off. I have a bit of severance, which is nice. I'm going to get involved again in some way. So I signed up to RGD as a provisional member and I joined their provisional committee and just started donating some time to that organization. And what was so incredible there was that the entire provisional committee was made up of people who had been working about as long as I had, right? It was folks who were sort of in the early stage of their professional career. And so it gave me an entire network of people to ask things like where are you looking for jobs right now? What are you putting on your resume? Is a one-page resume make sense? What are you building your portfolio website with, right? Like to ask those questions of, but then also opportunities to give back to the community more broadly. And I really, really enjoyed the giving back to the community part, like the hosting events, these asking questions, bringing groups of people together in interesting spaces brought me a lot of joy. It sort of filled my cup. So I stayed involved. I did my RGD certification, I think in 2014, 2015. So sort of shortly thereafter, I became eligible and I did that, which meant I was the certified RGD. I could put those 3 little letters after my name, but it also meant that I could start volunteering on the professional committees. So I joined the communications committee, which I don't remember if I joined it or if Hillary, the executive director, put me there, which is a thing Hillary's very good at, recognizing what people would be good at and where their skills might be helpful. And so I think my magazine communication background made sense there. And I spent a couple of years on that committee as a committee member, and then eventually as chair of that committee when I was eventually voted onto the board of directors. So I spent 2 years on the board of directors as just a director, representing the young folk. There were 2 of us on the board at that time, myself and motion designer Julian Brown, who were like the token kids at the table. It was like anytime they had to ask a question about something for the young folks, they were like, and what does Julian and Nicola think? But it felt really good to be able to offer up some insight from that generation. And the thing that I realized being on the board of directors was just how incredible of an opportunity it was to talk about some of the issues facing our industry with such a diverse group of people. So I learned a lot just from hearing other people's perspective on some of those issues. And when you're young and kind of naive, that was a really like a big growth moment for me, right? To be able to sort of see these folks that have lived through many more experiences in this industry have different opinions than me because they've had different experiences. And so, yeah, then the way that the organization works, eventually a president's term ends and another president gets voted in. So I was voted in as president in April of 2020.
Wow, big year for you, eh?
Yeah, just a big pivot. And, the truth is, I knew that there was the potential that I would become president of RGD eventually. It wasn't a surprise, but I didn't anticipate that it would happen in 2020, and I didn't anticipate that it would happen during a global pandemic.
And so what does that mean exactly, being president of the RGD?
So it's a volunteer position. So RGD does not pay me in any way, shape, or form. I donate my time to the organization. The way the organization is structured, so there is a staff who work at RGD. There is a massive base of volunteers. So those are members of the organization who volunteer their time and energy and knowledge to the organization. And then there's our membership below those volunteers. So the folks that are just members who are not actively volunteering their time, but are part of our community. And that sort of collectively is managed by or advised by a board of directors. So the board of directors is voted in by the membership every year in April at the annual general meeting. And within the board of directors, there are a certain amount of executive positions. So president, secretary, treasurer, VP positions. And so the board votes you into the position of president. So that's sort of how the structure works, which can feel a little bit confusing from the outside for sure. What it means for my actual involvement is every president has a slightly different take on it, but you are essentially an advisor to the organization. So you are having insight and helping to manage the committees or the groups of people that are doing work on particular things. So my job as I see it, and it's different for every president, my job as I see it is to be as open and aware of what is going on in as many corners of the industry as possible. I'm always trying to think about the issues that RGD is handling from the perspective of the academic who is focused on design thinking for big business, to our freelance design community, to our in-house design community, to Bob, who's working at the print shop on the corner, designing business cards for local businesses, right? Like our industry is quite varied. And so I see that as being my role, trying to keep eyes on as many projects and think about them from as many perspectives as I can to try and do the best we can for everybody who's part of our community. But I think as an industry, it's that idea of rising tides raise all ships. So sort of thinking about folks who are not members for whatever reason they're not members, and looking at things that are valuable to them as well.
Something else that you do that seems like a lot of fun from the outside with the RGD is hosting design thinkers in both Toronto and Vancouver. And you've done that. I think you've done 4 conferences total now, or is it 6?
Oh, I've done 4 in person now. I've done 2 in Vancouver and 2 in Toronto IRL. And so I've done at least 2 virtual, but I think we did like a emerging designer career conference in there too.
I mean, that looks like a lot of fun. You get to go on stage and host it, and you get to meet so many designers from all over the world because our Design Thinkers does have speakers come in from everywhere. What's your favorite part of doing that?
I love the energy at Design Thinkers so much. And I'm having a hard time figuring out if the energy is just like so overwhelmingly amazing because we're all still so excited to be back in person, or if that's just how Design Thinkers always is, and I just forgotten because during the pandemic it was different. But definitely that, and then I think also there are some incredible moments that little snippets of conversations that I get to have with some of my design heroes, my idols, people I've looked up to backstage that are just so valuable to me. I think about at this moment, so Swiss Miss Tina Roth Eisenberg, who is somebody who runs many businesses, but runs them all from a sort of a heart forward space. They're always feeling businesses. They're never run sort of the way that you think you have to run a business. And she's someone as a designer I've always looked up to, but then also as a business owner, a creative entrepreneur, and a community builder I've always looked up to. And she was at Design Thinkers Toronto this year. We had a cute moment on stage where I got to thank her for just being such an inspiration to me, and she gave me a big hug, and that's amazing. But the thing that stuck with me about my time with her was this little snippet. She probably doesn't even remember saying it backstage, but we were chatting about sort of all of the things, all of the businesses she's balanced over the years, and I asked some version of like, if you were sort of to go back and do it all over again, what would you do? And she was like, less. I would do less. And as somebody who's doing a lot in this moment, that was such an incredibly important little snippet of wisdom that I needed to hear in that moment. So those are always really fun. And I think that I love those little backstage moments because they also show me that our design heroes are just regular people. Some of the most put together speakers when they get on stage are the most chaotic backstage. Like they are balls of anxiety. Yeah. And some of the most sort of self-aware when they're in the spotlight folks are so not self-aware backstage. And so sort of that understanding of everyone's human. I think that's been sort of one of the biggest things for me. And then also just like the Design Thinkers community is so close to my heart. The sort of like energy that audience gives back to me, who has to be on stage performing all day for 2 straight days, is so fun. The folks that are yelling back from the audience or cheering along or laughing at my jokes or my screw ups, like that audience means so much to me. And then getting to chat with those folks afterwards, and they're folks that are coming in, in Vancouver, we're getting folks coming in from sort of middle Canada, up from Seattle, along the West Coast, flying in from the island. And in Toronto, we're getting folks coming from Sudbury. We're getting them come from Northern Ontario down, the East Coast come into town. Like those things, those hugs I get to share with volunteers it makes my year.
Is there something that you think that we're missing in Toronto, or is there something that you would like to see here as far as design community goes?
I think a lot of the groundwork has been laid for a lot of things that I want to see. So, salary growth is something I want to see more of for folks. More stable jobs and organizations is something I want to see. But I think a lot of the groundwork has been laid over the last few years for a lot of those things. I guess maybe something that I've felt is sort of missing is archives of work in some way, shape, or form. It's something that I've never quite been able to figure out. There are folks that are doing archival work in really specific areas. I think about what Blair's doing with Canada Modern, for example, but that's like a really specific moment in time and a really specific style of design. And I think the challenge for archiving or building some sort of design museum of some sort or archive is that it's hard to know what to include and what to exclude. And it becomes such a massive money and space problem, whether that's physical or digital space. But it's something that I wish we had access to a sort of deeper archive of historic Canadian design work.
So since you started issues in 2022 and you have kind of told everybody, hey, this is a community hub, this is a clubhouse, please come down. I know you can't compare exactly because you didn't have a store pre-COVID, but still, is there like a very excited kind of vibe when people come in? Are they like more thrilled to be somewhere that's like a community hub in a third space?
The community here, I always find, is incredibly supportive. Like the sort of like the support and the optimism for whatever the thing is we're doing, the exercise we're doing, or the project that's being talked about is pretty incredible, and an openness. So we do a whole host of different things, but I guess like the sort of closest to design events we do is hosting publishers, independent publishers, to talk about the magazine that they're doing. And we host those here in the store. So it's a group of about 30. We cap out at about 35 people. So it's not a huge group, but it's not a small group either. They're pretty casual conversations. So sometimes the publisher will do like a 10-15 minute presentation before we open it up to Q&A. The one we just did last week was just Q&A style. I just led the founders through a series of questions about the publication, and it gets opened up to the audience. It's a conversation more than anything. That one was we just did one with the founders of Square Feet, which is an interior design magazine. They've just launched their first issue late last year. It's quite beautiful. By the same folks who are responsible for Curves by Sean Brown. So it's also very cool and has a very sort of like music influence as well. Yeah, but they're just conversations. So I guess I noticed that they're so keen. Folks linger. The talk itself is an hour at max, but it's rare that it doesn't take another hour for us to clear everyone out of here. That one in particular, everyone arrived on time, which was strange. Like we give ourselves a half-hour buffer before the talk starts for people to trickle in. 6 o'clock, everybody was here.
Wow.
Yeah, it was so weird. Yeah, so I guess I don't have a comparison for if people are more excited for it, but I am really, really grateful for the community that's here. They're definitely the kind of folks that are lingering. They're introducing themselves to each other. They're keen to meet other people. They're curious about what folks are up to, and that part's been pretty cool.
So I want to ask you one other question, and then I do want to get into, like I mentioned way at the beginning, talking a bit about burnout and like work-life balance and stuff before I have to let you go. But I wanted to touch on this a little bit because I know it's kind of sort of a bugbear for you. The whole phrase "print is dead." I've always kind of thought it didn't make sense. I probably remember hearing about it first in like the late 2000s when the internet was really ramping up and journalism was moving that way. That was the context I heard it in. And certainly journalism as a field, I'm no expert, but it has been shaken up a lot in the last like 20 years. However, there's still lots of writing being done. Yes, publications are more online now, but they are obviously still in print too. So it never really made sense to me in some ways. And what's your take on that?
Okay, so the very first time that the phrase print is dead hit the zeitgeist, so pop culture, was actually 1984 Ghostbusters. And they were talking about, there's a scene, it's on YouTube. If you search print is dead, Ghostbusters, the scene will come up. It's in many a talk I've done. But they're actually talking about TV and not the internet. So this is a conversation that's been going on for a really long time. And I think the thing that's most important to note here, so 1984, that's 40 years that print has been dying, and print has persisted. So it still exists. 40 years later, we've been claiming its death. I think we can stop doing that. I don't think that print is going anywhere. I do think that it has changed, is changing, and will continue to change for a while. I don't think print publishing is the sort of the massive growth industry that it once was. I don't think that it's bringing in the kind of cash that it once did, but I also think that that's okay. I don't think that all businesses need to be paying out their investors or their top executives, $600,000 salaries. So I think there are new ways of publishing magazines that are maybe more sustainable. and a bit more sort of equitable across the board. And there are lots of interesting models for that happening around the world. And then I think when we think about what we understand, what you and I, given how old we are, understand as the sort of shift from print to digital, print is dead means the internet killed print to you. For that one, having been in magazine land when most of that happened, I look at who was saying that print was dead. And again, in hindsight, the folks that were telling us print was dying were not the magazine executives necessarily. It was the tech companies who were looking to take our advertising dollars. And here in Canada, we're in a really pivotal moment where publications 10 years ago, they gave their audience up to Meta, to Google. Like they just gave that audience away or gave their content away in order to build a digital audience, basically. And now that digital audience is owned by Meta because anything looked at on Facebook, those ad dollars go to Meta. They don't go to the Globe and Mail. And now the government is asking for those tech companies to pay the companies making the content that keep the users on the platform. So it's a whole mess. We are in a really, really messy space here. When you go and dig up the actual numbers for print publications versus digital, you will see that there hasn't actually been that much change since 2004. So we have roughly the same amount of magazines in circulation in North America as we did 20 years ago. We have about the same amount of magazine readers, print exclusive readers in North America as we did about 20 years ago. The difference is we are not seeing massive growth. So for a lot of folks, I think print is still one of their like primary places, primary access points for information. So print is very much still around. We're just not seeing the same kind of massive growth that we were seeing in the early 2000s. And remember that the internet is super young. So when we look at charts of sort of digital growth or digital advertising sales growth or digital sort of content growth, that's a chart that was starting at zero just 10, 15 years ago. So of course it's growing massively. And when we look at charts for similar print assets, those are charts that have sort of leveled out over time. And I think that sort of comes down to how you want to think about what makes a successful business. Is it massive growth? Is it sustainability? Is it quality of output?
And it's interesting that you say that there's been kind of a consistent number of publications in the last 20 years or so, even though you mentioned earlier how part of being in this space, especially as an editorial designer, means you have to kind of get used to these cycles of things closing, like the Grid closed and now Best Health is ending. Does that mean if businesses, if magazines are closing, that new ones are also popping up with kind of the same regularity to keep it sort of an even number, would you say?
Yeah, there's a fellow who goes by Mr. Magazine. His name's Samir, and he's been tracking these things in the States for the last little while. And the last set of numbers I saw was for 2022. I don't think he did a 2023 roundup yet. But in 2022, there were over 130 new titles that was launched last year. And that was the lowest number of launches in a calendar year for a long time. And that's just in the States. So we are seeing titles pop up as other ones go away. And I don't have the sort of business acumen to know if that's sort of common in other sectors, but I imagine it is. When I think about the sort of retail landscape, we see businesses go away and new things pop up to fill those gaps pretty regularly.
So I know I got to let you go in a few minutes, but I did want to touch a little bit on work-life balance, burnout. You mentioned at the beginning that you tried to take a sabbatical in 2020, which obviously didn't really work out the way you'd planned, because you realized you were burnt out and you needed this break. And now you're a very busy woman. You have a lot of things going on. So how do you manage that, or do you manage that? Do you think you're going for burnout again, or have you figured out some solutions?
I don't think I'm heading towards burnout again. I think that a lot of the work I'm doing right now is in alignment with just the kind of work I want to be doing. I get a lot of joy out of it, but also it's work that's in alignment with each other. So it's a bit of a Venn diagram. The work I do designing magazines plays into the work that I do selling magazines, the work I do building a community for the magazine industry, plays into the work that I do at RGD advocating for the design industry. Like, it is all sort of interconnected in that way. So it never feels like I'm wasting time working on any of those projects. And I think also they're all projects that I maintain a certain amount of control over the calendar. So when I get myself into a shitty place, time-wise, I only have myself to blame. And I think there is some value in that for me. I think a lot of burnout for me came from other people's expectations, or my perceived expectations that those people had, if that makes sense. And then I think it's also a balance, right? So, understanding sort of energetically what I'm capable of in a day. I am capable of so much of the sort of conversation having, and I'm only capable of so much emailing in a day. Like, it's not the same kind of output, I guess. And sort of understanding that, which I think just comes with time, sort of understanding your practice comes with time. And then also, I've become much less of a perfectionist over the years. And not to say that I don't bust my ass to do something as good as I can do it. There is also value in just making progress, in just doing it or starting the thing and not worrying about whether it's the best first draft you can write. And the thing I've noticed in doing that is how little folks notice when it's not exactly perfect.
Yeah. In some ways, I think, and it's probably true for a lot of designers, but we hold ourselves to higher standards than anybody really expects us to.
I think that, again, it's such a subjective thing. And I think, at least for me, I would end up in these spirals in the past where I would be like trying to produce the thing that I thought the person wanted me to produce, which meant I wasn't actually spending very much time producing the thing that I thought needed to be produced. Where I think now so much of the work that I do does come from a sort of me-centric space first. Like, or my own sort of observation, or is within my sort of realm of influence. I don't think any of us got into this industry to fulfill other people's visions. Most folks get into design because they see a career path in creativity, or they want to make something themselves, or they get joy out of making something beautiful, visualizing something that didn't exist before. And I think as we do that for clients, which is what the sort of commerce of design is, that's how we pay our bills. It's important to look after your creative self as well, right? So to be doing something that is for you and you only.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me. This has been awesome, and I could honestly talk to you forever about so many different things. But I appreciate you giving me some of your time, Lisa, today, even while you have obviously so many demands on your time already. So thanks for adding me to your busy schedule.
I'm so happy I could also talk to you all day, and we'll pick this back up in person one day soon.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much, Nicola. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you later.
Too. Bye.